All right, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. So unless you live under a rock, it's pretty obvious that the world is going from crises to crises that seem only to getting worse and worse. You got the genocide in Gaza, the Ukraine war, the recent war we just saw between Israel, US, and Iran, the rise of right-wing parties in most of the West, Trump, destruction of a living standard, public services, the rearmament of Europe, etc., all these different phenomena coming together. And, you know, this makes many wonder what the hell is happening with the world. And many people get overwhelmed or demoralized because it seems there's so little that can be done against that. The left is small, it is non-influential, and it is discredited in almost everywhere. The only political force which seems to be rising is the right wing or the populist right, like Nigel Farage, and which is also getting growing support among the working class. And the Labour government seems to be doing everything it can to help Farage arrive to power. As for the trade union movement or the trade union as a whole, they are often hollowed out, disconnected from the real concerns of the membership and on the back foot. And so it's easy for many people to get hopeless. And so today what I want to do, I don't want to bore everyone with a bunch of geopolitics and big conflicts. I will go through some of this, but I want to focus on how the current world situation, where does it come from? What is the fundamental driving force? How does it impact Britain? And then what do we do in Britain? What can we do about that? So first thing, what exactly is driving the turmoil around the world? Like, what is causing all these crises we're seeing? Now, liberals often will tell you that, it's Trump. Trump, he's a fascist. Trump, he's crazy. He's the one really driving all these crises. But Trump represents really something much broader, and you can't pin all the turmoil in the world on one individual. And anyway, it was Biden in power not long ago, and the world wasn't, in a much better place. Or else you have liberals, and in the media they'll tell you, it's Putin. It's Russian imperialism rising, That's why the world is really, in such a crisis, particularly since the Ukraine war, right? So Putin did attack Ukraine, but again, this is one individual, which is shaped by broader events. And as for the Ukraine war, really what's been happening in Eastern Europe for the last 30 years isn't the expansion of Russian so-called imperialism. It's been the expansion of NATO, of the European Union, all the way to the borders of Russia. And it's pretty widely known today that this is what triggered that war. This is what it's about. And honestly, beyond Ukraine, Russia is not really driving world event and is involved in actually a quite limited way in world events. Now, other people will say, it's Xi Jinping, it's China. It's the rise of Chinese imperialism. That's something else we hear often. Well, it's true that China has become a huge economic powerhouse, yes, but China hasn't invaded any other country. The Chinese Navy isn't patrolling the world seas. And in fact, in face of all this turmoil, the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party is really trying to present itself as a conservative force, as a force that wants to maintain the status quo, which is currently being ripped apart. So the source of turmoil isn't China. Maybe it's Brexit, right? We hear this a lot in the UK. It's Brexit, the original sin. No, it isn't Brexit. So there's one fundamental element which is behind every single crisis that we're seeing right now, and it's the United States, or more precisely, the ruling class of the United States, which rules not only the most powerful country on the planet, but is ruling an empire, the American empire. And it's the biggest empire the world, that humanity has ever seen. You never hear in the media about the American empire, but it exists. It is a thing. And this empire is in decline. The U.S. economic and military power is becoming weaker and weaker to the point where it's increasingly difficult for them to maintain the empire they have built. And if you think about it, every single crisis that we're seeing on the world stage right now has everything to do with the American empire and with its decline. So what I call the American empire, I'm not going to do whole history obviously, but it comes from the victory of the US in World War II. The US came out of World War II as the dominant power economically and militarily of the capitalist world. And it was so powerful, it unified all the old colonial powers, Britain, Germany, France, Japan, unified them in a sort of big alliance led and controlled by the United States. And all of this was done to confront the Soviet Union. That was the Cold War. And then in the early 1990s, the United States successfully destroyed the Soviet Union through massive economic pressure. And then all of a sudden, you were in a world where, from the Cold War, you entered in a world where the US was completely hegemonic. There was no counterweight anymore to the power of the United States, no more rival. And so that's when some proclaimed the end of history, the victory of liberal democracy over evil communism, etc. And we entered a world where free trade, free market, liberal values and institution, globalization would dominate. And this is what we refer to as really the liberal era of capitalism. You know, think of like Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, the Good Friday Agreement, New Labour, the European Union, etc., etc. However, the complete domination of the United States also contained the seeds of its decline. You know, a lot of the industry of the U.S., which the U.S. used to have such a power because of its industrial base. And during the 90s, it started before, but during the 90s, 2000, a lot of its industry was offshored to the global south. The U.S. overextended itself militarily, you know, in Afghanistan, Iraq, NATO expanding all the way to Russia. And then other countries saw massive growth. You know, China in particular became an industrial powerhouse. And so all these things weaken progressively the position of the U.S. And so today you get into a situation where the U.S. continues to be the dominant power, but finds itself in a weaker position. The U.S. still controls the financial market, controls the flow of most goods. The U.S. dollar remains the world reserve currency. That is, you know, the money used for most trade. And most countries are still aligned on the US, and obviously it continues to have the biggest military, 800 military bases across the globe, capable of intervening everywhere, as we just saw with Iran, and, you know, rain death whenever they need. And however, so you have all of this, while at the same time the economic weight of the US is declining. Their industries are lacking behind in many, many fields. And it's the decline of the US which is really creating this turmoil around the globe. It's this contradiction between their empire and their actual economic capacity to maintain it. And this is the contradiction which is always getting stretched and stretched and stretched to the point of rupture. And this is where Trump arrives. And Trump really is a product of American decline, like figuratively, but also like literally. So Trump really represents a shift in the American ruling class to confront American decline and really reassert US dominance. Hi, go on in. So Trump needs to reassert US dominance. He wants to get rid of those liberal ideas and institutions which characterized the sort of liberal era of capitalism. He needs to massively boost the US military. He needs to crack down on dissent. He needs to really squeeze, you know, internally and also externally the American empire. And this is why also, for example, he's cracking down on immigration. Not because the American ruling class don't want immigrants. No, they need cheap immigrant labor to exploit. What they want is a section of the working class to live constantly in fear. And Trump on the world scene needs to further squeeze its allies, get more out of them, to consolidate a solid pro-US bloc, fully aligned on the US interests to really confront China. That's really China is the main economic rival of the US, and every move they make on the scene is really to confront that threat, really. So despite what many might say in the mainstream press, when you hear about, oh, Russian imperialism, Chinese imperialism is taking over the world, really that's not what's happening. The Chinese Communist Party isn't trying to replace the US empire. In fact, they are trying to maintain really the status quo, the globalization as we have known it for years, while Trump is really tearing it apart. So China is not making a play for world domination. Actually, the US is moving in to confront and asphyxiate the Chinese economy. And it's similar for the Russian rulers, you know, they're not vying for world domination. What the Russian ruling class want is to renegotiate the security arrangement in Eastern Europe, you know, and get Ukraine. Iran, at the same time, you know, Iran is not trying to control the Middle East or anything like that. As the US bombing of Iran made clear, the real boss of the Middle East is the United States, which did control together with Israel, which is really a US proxy. So the big question of our time is not about Russian imperialism, Chinese imperialism, or just Trump as an individual. The main trend of our time is really the American empire in decline, reasserting its dominance. And the main question that's posed for anybody that wants to change reality really is, will the American empire be defeated, or will it drag the entire world in a succession of crises, wars, genocide, political reaction, as we've been seeing for the last few years? Because that's what it will take really to reassert American hegemony. That's what's necessary. And those various forces that I mentioned, the Chinese Communist Party, the Russian ruling class, the axis of resistance as well, the BRICS countries, all these forces cannot and do not want to defeat the US because they have vested interest in the status quo. They're incapable really of waging a consistent or even sometimes a progressive struggle against American hegemony, against the American empire. So faced with this, there's no shortcut. If we're going to talk about defeating the American empire, there's no shortcut to the mobilization of the working class throughout the world, but particularly in the US, in the West, in Britain, which is really the only force that has no ties to private property and the only force that can really wage a consistent struggle against the American empire and ultimately defeat it. Now, how does Britain fit in the picture I just laid out? So, since 1945, Britain has been a junior, imperial servant of the US, essentially. Still an imperialist power, obviously, but really subservient to the United States. And so Britain lost their big empire in the aftermath of World War II, and the US actually essentially took it over. And the British ruling class became a valet of the US. So they laundered the money in the city of London. They helped the US carry out their bidding, in Ukraine, in Asia, in Europe. The RAF base in Cyprus has carried out hundreds of flights to help Israel kill women and children in Gaza. And in exchange, Britain gets to have a privileged position in the American empire. It gets bigger crumbs than other countries, and they get to have nukes, which are provided by the US, actually. But in the context of the US reasserting its dominance, this special relationship, they like to call it this, means that Britain will get squeezed and will be expected to play a leading role in the US, putting its foot on the rest of the world. So a few days ago at the NATO summit, Starmer promised that Britain will aim to spend 5% of its GDP on military, on defense. This means that the British government has a few years to find, nobody really knows the number, tens of billions of pounds, maybe even over £1 billion to put into the military. And it's already obvious where they will find this money. The state is already full of debt. They have to take it from what exists right now. That means the NHS, the education budget, council budgets, benefits, roads, infrastructure, even wages. And already Starmer, as we've seen, is cutting the benefits of hundreds of thousands of disabled people to scramble a few billion that are going to go straight into the defense budget. Now, we'll see how much concession he makes to these Labour MPs, but I wouldn't put a lot of my hope on these backbencher Labour MPs who, by definition, have absolutely no backbone to fight anything. Anyway, same thing in Birmingham right now. We see there's bin workers that are on strike. They've been told to stomach £8,000 of pay cut in a year. And if this strike is defeated, really, and tragically the Unite, the union which is leading the strike, is doing such a rubbish job, really, at escalating the struggle that it might very well be, if this strike is defeated, this will be repeated across Birmingham and across other councils. So it will also mean the American empire really squeezing and Britain also squeezing would also mean more repression. So British rulers need to regiment society for war and crack down on dissent. And so you see it already with Palestine Action right now, for having spray painted a plane that's used to help Israel kill women and children. They are going to get classified as terrorists on the same plane as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So this is the decade of rejuvenation that Keir Starmer is serving. So British working people will have the honor of seeing their living standards, wage and public services slashed, their cities even more ransacked, and more immigrants deported as well, and those who denounce this jailed as terrorists. For what? So that in order to help the American empire shore up their position. This is what is driving all of this. And this is what is coming as well, the concrete reality, how it will impact Britain. Massive attacks on the arriving on the horizon. Now, the one thing that can counteract this, whether in Britain or also elsewhere really, is if there can be a solid enough fight back by the working class, particularly the organized labor movement, which can, really push back against this, stop the government in this rampage, and really, put back the interests of the working class to the fore. But this fight back by the working class isn't being organized. So why? You would think that those who lead the trade unions, who are supposed to defend and represent the interests of workers, would prepare serious struggles in the face of all these attacks that were coming. Which, by the way, I didn't even mention the possibility of economic crisis, which I believe will come, but that would also squeeze even more living standard. So you would think struggles would be, the trade unions would be getting ready. Well, you would be wrong, And this is the first and main problem I'll discuss today, is that the leaders of the working class in this country are propping up the government. So they all called to vote for it, to vote for Starmer's Labour a year ago. And since then, despite occasional criticism, they have been helping Labour navigate its never-ending crisis. So take Unison, one of the biggest public sector union. They're in a campaign right now, not to fight to better their members' condition, but to convince their members that labor and power is like an amazing thing for them. So they talk about, for example, the employment right bill. Do you remember, everyone, the employment right bill? No, you don't. You don't, because it's a tepid piece of legislation, but you read Unison. Oh, it's great. It's the greatest thing in the 20th century. You have the NEU, the teachers union as well, who are a little bit more, left, considered. Teachers are grossly overworked. They quit the profession in drove because they can't stand it anymore. But the NEU leaders are doing, once again, like a routinist campaign for pay up, it's the same thing again every years after years after years, which doesn't even address some of the main issues that teachers face, They're overworked, they can't stand it for this. And the union is not doing anything about that, which only fuels cynicism. And even worse now, you have people like Unite, the union, the leader of Unite is called Sharon Graham. She's considered to be a militant, but as well also as the GMB unions, they support the rearmament plan of Starmer's Labour. They're for it. And they literally offer the support of some of the biggest trade unions, because these are some of the biggest trade unions in the private sector. They really give the trade union movement to the government, helping it carry out its rearmament plan. And meanwhile, across the board, working conditions are only getting worse. And in all respect, in many unionized workplaces, you never see the unions, and most workplaces don't have a union because the union leaders have basically given up on trying to unionize non-unionized sectors. So why is it like that? The union leaders represent these small layers at the top of the organized labor movement, which is basically bought off by the government. They have huge salaries, big connections, privileges, particularly when it's labor in power. They are much closer politically to the establishment, to those in power, to the cabinet even, than to their own members. And they sort of function as this intermediary between the government and the working class, using their position really not to fight the government, but to help it carry its plan. So just consider this. In 2022, just at the beginning of the Ukraine war, so Sharon Graham, the leader of Unite, that some on the left support and claim she's militant, she organized an illegal and militant strike at Ellesmere port. For what? To stop Russian oil shipment coming to Britain. And she did that to strengthen the government's own section on Russia, because she thought they weren't going far enough. And obviously the ruling class didn't denounce her, because it aligned with what they wanted at the time. Meanwhile, like if you're in Unite, like if you're a bus driver in Unite, where's Josh? You can ask Josh, yeah, or a mechanic in Unite. Your conditions are absolutely terrible. You squeeze like a lemon. You don't have AC or heating in buses, and the bosses can basically do whatever they want. And the union is nowhere to be seen and doesn't do a damn thing. There's not even a rep on site. So you see, when it's time to fight the bosses, the union leaders are always full of excuses as to why they cannot do anything. Oh, yeah, there's the anti-union law, and we can't do anything, and there's regulation, and they say, oh, no one wants to fight. But when it comes to help British imperialism, suddenly these people are full of courage, initiative, energy, we'll break the law, who cares? So you see, that tells you something. Or then there's the genocide in Gaza right now, which obviously the British government is helping. Yes, your tax money is helping Israel carry out a genocide in Gaza. And many unions did issue some statement against the genocide, although some didn't. But there hasn't been a single trade union actions carried out against this genocide, like anything serious, or even like a symbolic one. We've seen some in Spain and France, which were largely symbolic, I think. There hasn't been even this here. And unionized workers are handling these weapons. So Unite and the GMB, they have members in the arms industry, and they openly argue that the US and Britain raining bombs around the world is a good thing for these workers, which it isn't anyway. And as other unions, for example, like the RMT, which is considered more to the left, they make a ton of declaration, and they make speeches at demos as well for Palestine, yet they refuse really to lift a finger to actually try to do something. The RMT has members in transport, in ports, even in the Royal Navy's auxiliary fleet. They have members there, but nothing has been done, because it crosses the red lines of the government. Because they'll get a phone call from the Labour Party HQ saying, what the fuck are you doing? And this is why, in a nutshell, the huge movement for Palestine has been impotent. So you have this huge parade, and yes, they are parade, I go to them, I'll still go to them, but let's be real, they are big parade that don't change anything, that don't advance the fight. And the working class is not there in any organized form, and no really organized action has been taken by the trade unions. That's why the Palestine movement in Britain doesn't advance. And just a quick point on the RMT. The RMT is concentrated in transport, and which is a huge strategic sector of the economy, rail in particular. The entire system of rail maintenance in Britain is all based on this it's not archaic, it's like totally messed up and disorganized system of subcontracted companies, which subcontract companies, they hire workers at 0-hour contract, treat them like it's the 19th century. You can ask Zimon here, he's part of this. And really, that's how the rail system works. You wonder why the trains are always late. Like, don't go look further than that. And the RMT has done really no serious effort to try to change this status quo to class struggle. So they have a campaign right now, for example, which is called End Rail Outsourcing. But it's a campaign which really consists of petition, write to your MPs, and let's try to sign up as much MPs to try to push a little further the Labour Party sort of tokenistic nationalization of the train system. And that's it. That's the strategy here. And meanwhile, it will take certainly solid class struggle to rearrange the entire way the rail maintenance system is organized, but it isn't being prepared by the RMT. Anyway, so that was sort of a digression. I just want to mention another thing. There's a strike going on in Birmingham, the bin strike. I mentioned it earlier, led by Unite. And let me put it simply. The Labour Party is in power. Birmingham is a Labour-run council. Unite is one of the biggest donor of Labour, if not the biggest, among the trade union. So let me tell you that they didn't put up a real intense struggle. That's the problem. The strike is being dragged down. It's been like, 15 weeks or something? And it's the oldest trick in the book. You drag on the strike, drag it on, drag it on, drag it on. Workers get demoralized. Then you present a sellout deal, which workers accept out of despair, and then you can wash your hands of it. This is what's happening in Birmingham right now by the whole militant Unite leadership. This is what is being done to these bin workers, with the union leadership refusing to do what's needed to really escalate the strike. And so these are just a few pictures of how the union leaders of this country are assisting the British ruling class, really squeezing the working class, which in turn assists the American empire. So there's a direct connection here between the union leaders refusing to wage the most minimal fight, whether it is like AC in buses, whether it is good conditions in railroad, whether it is like schedules that are livable for teachers and nurses. There's a connection between the union leaders refusing to do this and their support to the American empire through their support as well to the Labour Party. The reason they won't organize real struggle for even basic condition is that this struggle requires confronting the Labour parties. It requires really to go up against the empire, really, and those who defend it. And they won't cross these lines. So these things are not disconnected, like the big geopolitics that's happening in the world and what we see in your day-to-day jobs, in living conditions, in housing, etc. All these things are connected, and the reasons the struggles are not advancing is really because the leaders, those who are supposed to defend the interests of the working class, actually play for the other side. So that's one of the main things I want to say today. And so any fight back by the working class against the coming cuts has to be a struggle against those currently in charge of the labor movement. Now, if we want to fight back in the working class, and I'm sure if there are people here today which have tried to organize fight back in their workplace, build their union, you might wonder, like, is it fair to say that it's only the union leaders? Because haven't you encountered another big obstacle, maybe apathy? That exists a lot in the class, you know. You try to organize struggle and it doesn't pick up. Sometimes people don't want to fight, you know. Workers see that things are going tits up and they're like, well, I'm not going to put my neck on the line here. You know, I'm just going to look down, protect my thing, do my own thing, and I don't want really to get engaged. And I think can get frustrated, particularly for socialists. I think everybody here almost is a leftist. It can get very frustrating because you look at these people, they know they're screwed, you know? Like, I think probably a majority of teachers go home at the end of the day crying. Or some workers, they lose their shit once in a while. You know that these people can't, like, take it, yet when it comes the time to, like, take this step to collectively fight back, oh, they hesitate, you know? They're unsure, you know? Or else another problem you see if you do work in the working classes, you see workers looking to Farage or even Tommy Robinson. That's not uncommon at all. Workers turning to the right who believes that immigrants are a much bigger problem than their bosses squeezing them, right? And that's a real problem which we must confront, you know? But first, like, why is that so? Why does this exist? So it's important to understand the broader context in the country right now. So we find ourselves in a situation where the US empire is turning the screws, like I said. There's a lot of uncertainty and crisis ahead. The trade union movement is weak and propping up the government, and the left is utterly discredited among large areas of the working class. And also, although there are attacks coming and attacks ongoing right now, there isn't also a huge economic crisis yet. The middle class is getting squeezed, but it is getting squeezed sort of slowly at the moment. And this and more fuels sometimes the illusions that you know, you can maintain your heads above water through other means than collective action, you know, by playing it nice, by climbing the ladder, by trying to get like an individual deal, hustling, you know. And also for most workers, they do not see at the moment another serious alternative which can actually push forward collective struggle, fight back in order to improve these conditions. There isn't such force out there at the moment. So all the workers are fed up. These various conditions mean they will not necessarily throw themselves into struggles at every moment and at every junctures. And you know, the reaction sometimes workers have is to protect themselves and sort of to not get into this. And on the political level, this situation is due to the complete failure of the radical left to really offer an alternative to the profound anger of the working class. So for years now, during the liberal era that I mentioned, when liberalism really was the dominant ideology, and as the working class was getting pummeled in the name of these liberal ideas and institutions, the left really pursued alliances with liberals, middle-class intellectual of the middle class, or even sometimes of the upper class, at the expense of the working class. And Corbyn, for example, is the perfect example. He spent his tenure trying to keep unity with the Blairites, with the supporters of the Iraq war, of austerity, of Israel, etc. And this made him weak, and he became their puppet, and he ended up campaigning for a second referendum. So workers turned their back on Corbyn and turned their back on the left more generally. So unity with the liberals really totally discredited the left and broader layers of the working class. And then there was the strike wave in 2022, 2023. I always keep in mind an anecdote that Comrade Haider told me. He used to be a train driver up north, and he told me a while ago how, you know, a lot of his coworkers were pro-Farage, or quite right-wing. And then when the strike wave came, they started to look to Mick Lynch. They started to like Mick Lynch. Mick Lynch was the leaders of the RMT union. And because he was talking militant, he was like maybe promising a struggle. And oh yeah, maybe we'll get somewhere, you know. They started to stop talking about Farage and start talking about Mick Lynch and about strike, and there was a certain energy. Then when it came clear that the strike wave was a joke, that this was not a serious struggle, that Mick Lynch talked the talk but did not walk the walk, they, with just a few tepid days of action here or there, strike days here or there, it wasn't like a real struggle, they progressively all went back to Farage. I mean, correct me if the anecdote is not correct, but that's what you explained to me. And so the strike wave was a defeat. It was a huge opportunity to change the balance of forces in the country, to pull the plug on the hated Tory government on the terms of the working class. But the union leaders made sure that it didn't happen, channeled support into Starmer's labor, and now we find ourselves in a much more difficult conditions to push for this fight back, to put the class in a defensive position. Because, you know, often workers, they tried industrial action in 2022-23, and many concluded that it didn't work, or at least it didn't change a damn thing. And in some union, it became worse. You know, if you talk to postal workers, if you talk to members of the UCU, these unions were literally worse off after the strikes than before because of the policy pursued by the leaders of these trade unions. And so you see, in fact, apathy, despair, shift to the right, all these actually get back to the question of leadership, of having a fighting alternative around which workers can gather and push the kind of struggle which can actually change their conditions using class struggle methods. But because the leaders of the left and the trade unions really refused to break with the liberal establishment, refused to mount a serious struggle against the British ruling class, and because of their support, open or concealed, to the American empire, to the British ruling class, this has wasted huge opportunities to change the balance of forces. This is what has fueled apathy, despair, and this is what fueled a lot of workers turning to Farage and Tommy Robinson even. It's not just that they're racist, you know. Of course, there's backward attitude that we must be combated, but fundamentally they find in Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson a radicality, a break with the status quo that they do not find elsewhere. Certainly not in the left or in the labor movement. It's the same thing in the US with so many workers voting for Trump. And often workers who do look to Farage or to Trump or these figures are also the most militant ones. On the picket lines, for example, in Birmingham, many workers, you know, are quite militant, quite trade unionist, quite conscious trade unionists, sorry. Yet, often, sometimes the reason they like Workers' Hammer, I don't have my copies, sometimes because there's a big picture of Farage on it, you know? And so you have these contradictions that we need to exploit and that liberals also, those who have a liberal framework, absolutely don't get. And it's the same dynamic sometimes which lead to the fact that sometimes the most militant workers are not in the union. That happened quite often. They've quit it long ago out of anger and they're sick of it, you know. That's not good, you know. We want workers to join unions, but that exists, and it means also that sometimes those who are in the unions are the more conservative elements. They might be in the union because it might help to advance their career or, you know, for different reasons. It's not always the case, obviously, but this dynamic happens too. So when you're confronted with demoralization, with despair, when you try to push for struggle and it doesn't quite bite, you have to remember, as an individual militant, you are up against all this accumulated baggage of frustration, of broken hopes and promises, of lack of an alternative, which are all exacerbated by the weight of life in broken Britain. And this does not fall from the sky. It's the price to pay for the betrayals of the leaders of the unions and those of the Labour Party, particularly the left of the Labour Party. Because there's a price to pay for wasted opportunities, for sellout strikes, for support to this wretched government. And this is why I'm so hard against the union leaders, and the Sparts are so hard all the time against the union leaders, because they led us where we are now. So this doesn't mean we give up. No, we don't give up. We need to fight. But we must understand in what conditions we prepare the struggle. And we also know that events will help to shake up also this baggage of frustration which make these things harder. You know, every day as the US further tightens the screws, as the British government, as a valet, also tightens the screws, living standard gets squeezed, and so does the illusion that, well, you can make it, you can better yourself by playing elbows, by having like a better deal with your boss, by sort of these meals of hustle. Now I'm getting to what to do, and I'll try to wrap this up. I know it's hot. I just want to make a little point about the far left, other leftist group. there is a lot of groups that claim to be socialists in this country. There's too many of them. Like you know, you can't distinguish sometimes yourself. It's a whole mess. Workers already find this totally unserious. It's a real problem. But with all our difference, I can guarantee you that no one else on the far left, as far as I know, talks about the things I just talked about right now. The American empire, the union leaders' support to it, their countless betrayal because of it, but also the actual mood in the working class, the real conditions that militants face. And most of socialist groups in this country live in, I believe, is cuckoo land, like La La Land. There's a huge divide between the working class and the radical left. There's also a divide between the trade union movement, I would say, and the working class, but it's even sharper with the radical left, socialists, and the working class. It wasn't always the case, but right now there are two, like many workers hate the left, or at best are totally indifferent to the left or to socialists. And they see socialism as this sort of thing for like middle class enlightened individuals who you know, call you a racist everything you say something wrong, or glue themselves to the pavement. Like that's how most workers see socialists. And I'm not saying this is what all socialists are doing, but the reason such conception exists is also because of what socialist groups have been doing and continue to do. So for example, the trade union movement is full of socialists in this country, but not in the base, in the top layers. A ton of socialists run unions or run for union posts, but you would hardly ever know because they usually don't do something different than the suits, than the bureaucrats, you know? They get elected in dessert and branch meetings that workers don't go because it's a bloody waste of time. Then they get posts, then they write in their newspaper that they have posts, and then they use these posts to basically lawyer for the status quo in the trade union movement. So the RMT, for example, is led by a bunch of people who are sympathizers of the Communist Party, let's put it this way. One of the leader of the Birmingham strike I mentioned is close to the Socialist Party, was a Tusk candidate. And the Socialist Party is super active in Unite. And you know what it does in Unite? It supports Sharon Graham, the main leaders, which is screwing up workers. The Socialist Workers' Party has a ton of people in leadership position in the NEU. And what are they doing to rebuild this union, to go against Daniel Kabiri? Socialist Alternative, that's another group which is full of union officials. What are they doing? Socialists are everywhere in the trade unions, but nowhere in the working class. Or else you have the Revolutionary Communist Party. They have posters everywhere about communism and revolution. Yet they speak about communism in a way which doesn't connect at all with the actual reality of workers. And with what they leave, that makes that connection between these grand principles and their actual living conditions. They boast they have like 1,200 members, mainly students. But as far as I know, I haven't heard of a like single union branch led by the RCP, which was doing something different than you see with the bureaucracy. And many socialists continue to just act in a purely liberal manner. So for example, the Socialist Workers' Party with its campaign, Stand Up to Racism. So they have this campaign, they push it a lot in the NEU, and they organize these demos against Tommy Robinson. And so we do need to build United Front demonstration against Tommy Robinson, but Stand Up to Racism really organized on the basis of pure moralizing liberalism. Its politics are really about moralizing workers, treating any workers that you know, looks to Farage as just a fascist, while remaining silent on the Labour government because they don't want to lose their backers in the Labour Party, their backers in the TUC. And this just really reinforced the divide between workers and the left. And then there's the Green Party. I'm not even going to get into the Green Party. Like a lot of leftists now think that the best thing we need to do is to build a Green Party. It's like the Green Party are the most liberals of all liberals, really. Workers hate the Green Party. So we see that, why am I saying all of this? So we have all our disagreements about China, the Ukraine war, you know, Iran, all these big political questions, and these are important disagreements. They're important things to discuss. But these debates don't matter unless they're about how to advance the working class, how to advance its struggle in the here and now, and against immiseration, against the US turning the screws. So all socialists oppose NATO, for example, but then there are plenty of socialists in this country who support union leaders that support NATO. Well, that's the problem in the British far left, really. And they really support and help the trade union leaders that I really identified as the main cause of the impotence of the British labor movement, you know? Hi. Anyway, so what to do? One thing that I hate in the left is sugarcoating reality. When you transform defeat into victory, when you pretend that things are fine or up and up and up. So no, in this speech I wanted to just lay it out plainly, the truth about the conditions, you know? And I wanted to really talk about this because we can talk about the great geopolitics or whatever and we can have a discussion about this, but I wanted to talk about how can we fight back and what conditions do we find ourselves in to fight back. And I wanted to say it like it is, you know, it's tough, you know, the US is turning the screws, the unions are weak, the right is growing, attacks are on the way, the left is isolated and divorced for the working class. We must recognize this reality or else you can't start, you're going nowhere. And for us socialists, we want to fight and defeat the American empire. There's no shortcut really. What we need to do and what the left needs to do is to turn to the working class and fight for what it needs. Seek to rebuild union power and the power of the organized labor movement. Because in the end, this is the only thing that workers have to defend themselves, to protect themselves against coming attacks. But the problem is that the unions are not acting this way at the moment because they're controlled by bureaucrats who support the American empire. So for us, our main task is to turn to the working class, get in there, fight for what it needs, as minimal as it might be, and connect those minimal struggle, whether it is for I don't know, AC for against, you know, the current heat right now that we're facing, anything, connect this to the general cause of these problems, which is the decline of the American empire, and the reason why there isn't a fight back in the organized labor movement, which is, as I explained, the fact that those who lead the working class support the American empire. And that actually, if you want to fight, even for the most minimal things, you need trade unions who are ready to go on to battle against the entire empire, including its little servants in the Labor Party. And that's really the key things for us. And we need to have fights and debates in the left about exactly these questions so that the left get out of the cuckoo land they're about, looks at the situation, you know, with clear eyes. You know, the left is tiny. Like, look at us. We're not, you know, none of us is like the Revolutionary Party. But the reason is we need to rebuild these links with the working class and rebuild the trade union. And it's not easy. It's fucking hard, actually. It's hard work. But if you want easy, you go do something else. Because this is what's required for the period at the moment. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully people can intervene, have a discussion, have a back and forth. And yeah, that's that.
Okay, thank you.